Thanks, Bruno. I appreciate that. So I'm excited to be here, and I want to talk to you today for about 30 minutes on what I call designing our futures. And I was so excited to come to Portugal that I even came a couple days early, and I found a race, a 100-kilometer race out in the eastern mountains of Portugal that I ran on Saturday, and it took me almost 19 hours to finish. And I say that not because I love talking about running, which I do, and I'll talk to any of you if you want to later, but I sort of use this and see this as a metaphor for what I want to talk about today, because you can have a plan and a process for how you're going to train for a race like this, but when you actually get out there the day of and everything falls apart, you need to rely on sort of principles and strategies to actually finish, because the plan doesn't hold. So this talk has 3 parts today. The first part's a bit of framing. The second part will go into some of these principles, sort of what I call first principles of design, things that I learned and still hold to be true. And then the third part about a vision for the future and how do you maybe apply these to shape the vision of reality that you want to see. All right, so Bucky Fuller, someone that I like and look up to a lot. We're called to be architects of the future, not its victims. And he saw the challenge in this of how do we create a future that is good for 100% of humanity. Not just those of us in this room, not just those of us who have access to resources, but 100% of humanity. And I don't think that we're there yet. I think we have a long way to go to get there. But I think it's something that we still should strive for. And so one of his ideas of how do we do this was to be a comprehensive designer. And for him, that's an artist, an inventor, a mechanic, an objective economist, an evolutionary strategist, all sort of rolled up into one. I think that's a lot to live up to, right? I don't think that I could ever achieve that in my lifetime. But I think it takes a lot of things to sort of have a strong impact on the world, right? So you got to sort of study all these things. And he saw this role as the objective designer or comprehensive designer, someone that sort of sat outside of the halls of industry and the halls of science, and sort of observed and took advantage of the products of things that were produced, and then manipulated them as a way to create something good for humanity. And I think that this is a role that we should be playing. And I think as we'll go through today, I want to use some of these principles instead of the ones that Bucky Fuller has outlined, but use some of the principles that we'll talk about today as sort of foundations that we can rely on to sort of be this comprehensive UX designer as we try to shape the future. But I see a problem to this, right? As UX design gets adopted by more and more industries, and we get sort of our seat at the table and all this stuff that we've been trying to get, I see this thing that I'm calling the cargo cult of UX or design. And is anyone familiar with what a cargo cult is? So a couple people. So for those of you who aren't, a cargo cult was the Melanesian islanders after World War II, when all of the air bases were removed. They had sort of gone through a time where they had gotten all these resources and goods from the soldiers during the war. And after the war, they created things like this plane made out of straw, and they created whole runways and sort of enacted rituals to copy what the soldiers were doing in hopes that these goods and resources would continue to come to the island. They had sort of become accustomed to that. And of course, they didn't, right? There's sort of hollow acts, that nothing happened. And I kind of see that that's what's happening to some places in the UX field where I talk to clients and potential clients, and they sort of want these artifacts, but they don't really know why they want them or what they're going to be used for. They become just checkboxes in a process that we go through. And I think if we don't sort of confront this, it's detrimental for our whole industry and our whole discipline. Hopefully not all of you are experiencing this out there. That would make me really sad. But I think this is something that we need to confront. So if you just sort of bear with me, and if everyone would just take a deep breath in and just hold it. And then when you're ready, just feel and release it, but think about what that's like to release that breath. So you take thousands of breaths every day, but hopefully the one that you just took, you thought a little bit more about, right? And I think that if we use that as a metaphor for the space that I want to create over the next 30 minutes, a lot of these concepts that we might talk about might not be new to you, right? It might be something that's in your practice every day, but just take the time over this next 30 minutes to sort of reflect on what does it mean to do the practice that we do so that you can think about it maybe a little bit differently or a little deeper than what you typically do when you're at your job and sort of going through the motions. All right, I think we have 5 principles that we want to look at today. So first, if you just close your eyes and think about a moment in time in your life when you are at your happiest moment in your life. Maybe you have a couple, just pick one. And when you get done with that, you can open your eyes. All right, how many people, by a show of hands, that moment that you thought of had a piece of software or a digital product as the sort of key player? Anyone? Don't be ashamed. It's okay. Yeah, so we have a couple. All right. Show of hands, how many people in that moment that you're happiest in your life, you had another person was involved in that memory? Yeah, almost everyone, right? And so we spend so much time in our work creating these digital products and these services, but it's really about the people and the connections that we have at the human scale that make our lives the happiest. So I think I want to remember, right, that it's about the people that we're making this for. It's not about the objects. It's not about fetishizing these objects that we make, even though we pour our hearts and souls into making them. So this is Joe Ballet. He was one of my mentors when I was a young designer at Maya Design. And this is probably 10 years old at this point, but I think it's still really meaningful. We put together a little video just sort of explaining why we do the work that we do.
Now, our goal as designers of this thing should not be to have this object be an end in itself. You know, the happiness isn't going to come from engaging in this new piece of software. You know, if by using this product or by owning this product or coming in contact with this product, you see it as a window through which you engage more meaningfully with life, then I think we've done the right thing. But you notice where that puts the emphasis. The emphasis is not on the product. The product becomes like a hole that you look through, right? It's a kind of very Zen sort of notion, you know, it is in its transparency that it fulfills its function.
So it's in its transparency that it fulfills its function. For me, this is at the core of what we should be doing as designers. Yes, we make these products, but it's not about fetishizing these things. It's about how are we having an impact on people's lives, and how are we making their lives better in some form or capacity, right? Whatever it is that you're making. So it's about people. It's not about the object. That's the first thing I want us to remember. The second thing, if it's about people, people have experiences. People don't have functions. So let's focus on those experiences. To highlight this, if everyone just get out a piece of paper or something, a piece of paper and a pen to just do a little sketch. If you don't have something you get out, you can just sort of do this mental exercise in your head. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds. And I want you to design a vase. Just sort of sketch it out on your paper. Design a vase. Whatever that means to you. All right, time's up. You can, whether you're finished or not, you can just sort of show your neighbor. Sometimes we sort of call these out, but I think for time's sake, we just show your neighbor what you came up with. Most people probably design some sort of object, right? Maybe something like this over here where it's a vessel, it has an opening, you can put a flower in it. It could be tall, it could be short, it could be any sort of shape, right? But you probably came up with a vessel of some kind. Let's do this exercise again, but this time, I'll give you another 30 seconds. This time I want you to design a better way for people to enjoy flowers in their home. Again, whatever that means to you, sort of sketch something out quickly. All right, I'm going to call time on everyone. Sort of show your neighbor what you had. Maybe you can briefly try to explain to them if it's not really clear. So most people when you start designing at this scale, you start to move in a couple different directions, right? You might focus on the relationship between the flower and the observer. Some people like to focus on the temporal aspects of the life cycle of a flower. Maybe some people came up with that, or people start to put the flower in context of the home or a larger context of how it relates to other things in the home, right? That's often something that we see happen. Now we could do this again, we won't today, but design a better way for people to connect with nature, right? So we're growing the scope even larger. And we get different solutions each time we sort of grow the scope outside of the object of the thing that we're designing. So we need to focus on experience, not on the function of what it is that we're making. All right, thirdly, stories. So I think there was a workshop yesterday, day before, about storytelling, right? Stories shouldn't be anything new, I think, to this community, hopefully not. But stories for me are how, they're sort of two sides of a coin, how we understand the world, but it's also how we shape the world. And so for me, when I think of stories, I think of culture. And I think of Clifford Geertz, who said that culture is simply the ensemble of stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. So why is that important, right? Why do we care about stories and culture? And so if we think about a diagram like a pace layering diagram, which I'm not going to go into full detail of how it works, but what I want you to take away is that you see that culture is down here at the bottom, very closely tied to nature, and that things on the outside of the circle like commerce and fashion move and evolve very quickly. They're more dynamic, where things like culture and nature evolve very slowly, much less dynamic. So if we think about stories being the constructors of culture, then if we understand these stories, then we have something we're keyed into something very close to sort of what makes us human, right? And they evolve very slowly, and they're very long-lasting if we can really get at what's the meaning behind these stories. So when I think about stories too, I think about Harry Crews, who's an American author and playwright, and I want to play a clip for you from a documentary about American Southern culture, where he talks about stories.
The truth of the matter was, stories was everything, and everything was stories. Everybody told stories. It was a way of saying who they were in the world. It was their understanding of themselves. It was letting themselves know how they believed the world worked, the right way and the way that was not so right.
So there's a lot there. You might not have caught it all. But I think the key points here that I want you to take away is that it's a way of saying who we are in the world. When we tell stories, it's us expressing who we are, right? It's us expressing our understanding of ourselves, and it's us expressing sort of the rules that we live by, our worldview. What are the boundaries between right and wrong? All of these things come out in the stories that we tell. And that's why they're so important. But they're important not just, again, as a way to interpret what's happening outside in the world around us, and what are the stories of our customers maybe that they're telling us. What are the stories that our friends or spouses are telling us, right? And help us understand how they're thinking, right? What's their worldview? What's their value system? What's their belief system? But the stories that we craft are embedded as well with these value systems and these belief systems. So when you put a product out into the world and you tell a story about it, you're making ethical choices about the belief systems and the value systems that product promotes. And I think we need to think a little bit more deeply about these stories that we're telling and how do they jive with the stories that exist in the world, so that in the end, we create stories that are going to be meaningful for us and that move us in a direction of a world that we want to live in. So stories are both how we understand the world and how we as an agent shape the world. All right, the next one I want to talk about is this idea of problem finding before problem solving. And to do this, I want to use an example from Daniel Pink's, one of his latest books called To Sell is Human. If anyone's read it, it's really good. If you haven't, it's really accessible about motivation and sort of what motivates us and creativity. So I'll put this up here if you want to read it, and then we'll talk about it. I'm just kidding. I'll tell you what it says. It's basically a case study of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who wrote the book Flow. If anyone's familiar with that, you probably are. If you're not, again, I recommend reading it. But in the mid-'60s, he ran an experiment with art students around the nature of creativity. And basically what he did was he had two tables set up. He brought a bunch of fourth-year art students in, and they had to select from, I think, 27 artifacts on the table, and put them on the other table and create a still life. That was the assignment. And so what happened was he saw sort of two behavioral groups emerge from how they approached this. So one group came in, picked an object, put it on the table, and drew the still life. And he called this first group problem solvers. And they were sort of asking the question, how do I do good work? How do I draw a good still life, right? Sort of the craftsman's question. But there was another group of people, another group of art students that came in and maybe they circled the table, maybe they picked up the objects and they took a little more time investigating the objects and compared them to each other. Maybe they put them on the table to create the still life and then they rearranged them and maybe rearranged them again. Maybe they went back to the table and grabbed some more objects. They took more time and they investigated the objects more. And then they ended up drawing the still life, right? They asked the question, how do I do good work? But first they asked the question, what is good work? What does it mean to make a good still life? What is good art? I think this gets back to some of the stuff that Dan Klein was talking about this morning around what does it mean, what does good mean, and how do we understand that as an individual? So we called this group problem finders. And I think this is interesting in and of itself. But they had an art show afterward, and all the winners of the art show from the expert judges were from this problem finders group. And then he found these art students 10 years later in the mid-70s, and about half of the students were still engaged in artistic careers. And almost exclusively, those art students that were still engaged in artistic careers came from the problem finders group. He went back again about 10 years later in the mid-80s and found these problem finders that were still practicing art. And by all measures of success of an artistic career, they were more successful than their peers. So I think there's something really interesting happening when you start to ask questions about what is good before you start making the stuff that you're making. He said that this is the quality of the problem found is a forerunner of the quality of the solution attained. Right? If you're not asking good questions and solving interesting problems, the solutions that you come up with are only going to be so good, right? They're not going to be earth-shattering. They're not going to be amazing. So you have to ask really good questions to get to really good solutions. And for me, this is about reframing problems to open up new solutions and new opportunities. And this is what I do with all my clients. It's part of the work that I find the most interesting. But it's something I think that it's, again, foundational to the work that we should be doing. We shouldn't just be making stuff to make stuff. Even if it's really good stuff, if it's not solving the right problems, if we're not asking the right questions, then we could have done better. So problem finding before problem solving. Right, so we talked about storytelling. But I think we need to move beyond just the idea of narratives in stories and use that data that we collect from these stories to create abstractions and create models, right? And so we go through this process, this cyclical process of we have data that we've collected maybe, and we put some representation on it, right? We sort of draw it out into a model. And then through that process, we learn something from that representation that makes us look at the data that we have in a different way. And so we go through this cycle until that model becomes relatively stable. And then we can say, yeah, I think we got it. I think we have some representation here that we can maybe then abstract out beyond just the instances in which we collected that data. And I think that's where it gets interesting, right? And so models have been part of my design process when I was at Maya and beyond. This is some work that we did for Target.com early on, years ago, like 10 or more years ago, when we were just sort of trying to understand what is this new thing called e-commerce, right? And how do people shop online? And how are they different and similar? And how are they motivating themselves? And where are they spending their time? This is an early prototype of a precision farming system that we made. But before we got here, we started with a model, right? How does this idea of precision farming fit into people's lives and fit into their understanding of their farm? So we had to create the model before we could get to the prototype. So not only do we create models to represent data that we've collected, but we can also use other models or other frameworks to try to understand experiences that we have with products. So this is a Fitbit One, right? It's an activity tracker that's several years old at this point. I was interested in using it because of its sleep data. I started using it, and I found out immediately that something was wrong, right? And so let me try to sort of lay this out for you. I'd go to bed after my wife went to bed, so I'm walking into this pitch black room. I get undressed, I put the little Fitbit thing onto the little wrist thing, and then I push the button and hold down the button to turn it into sleep mode, and this is what happens. So I get this bright light, counting down in tenths of a second. Hopefully I'm going to sleep for like 6 to 8 hours, but tenths of a second. And it just was always jarring. Every time I did it, it was jarring. I was like, this is broken, this is broken. But I couldn't articulate exactly why it was broken until I started working with Scott Sullivan, who had a workshop here yesterday on wearables, and I think he has one tomorrow. And Scott introduced me to this thing called Lisbon movement analysis. And this gave me a language to be able to understand why this experience I just had was broken. So basically, you map human movement or any movement into these 3 analyses or spectrums: weight, space, and time. And they have, polar sort of ends, right? Direct or indirect, sustained or sudden, light or strong or heavy. So if we map my experience with the Fitbit onto this, it was strong and direct and sudden. And this is what Lisbon calls punching. So the Fitbit was essentially punching me in the face 10 times a second as I'm trying to go to sleep. And that's why this was broken, of course. That makes so much sense. So the interesting thing about these frameworks is they not only give us a language to describe things in the world, but they also give us levers to make changes. So if we shift all of these to the opposite poles, now we're in an effort that Lisbon calls floating. And floating is where I would rather be when I'm trying to fall asleep as opposed to being punched to sleep, right? So simple example, this obviously is not sort of what is intended, but you can sort of see on the left and the right, the Fitbit versus something that's more floating in terms of its representation. Okay, so I picked up another Fitbit model. I was curious to see, have they made any changes? How are they approaching this now? How do I put this one into sleep mode? So this is how you do in this version. All right, there it is. It's in sleep mode now. So I'm still punching. This time, at least, I'm punching the Fitbit. It's not punching me anymore. I still don't think that's a full solution. And did anyone see the creepy eyes? Is it going to be watching me all night long? Maybe that was what was intended. I'm not sure, but it's a little creepy. All right, so here's the framework, right? So I think frameworks like this are going to be more and more useful as we start moving into designing experiences that are off screens, right? Designing experiences with physical products that have smarts in them, designing experiences in built environment with sensors in them. We need to understand how human movement affects emotions and how it affects other people. So I have a workshop tomorrow. We'll be exploring this. We'll actually be embodying these different efforts ourselves to understand what it feels like to move in these different ways, and then we'll have a design intervention trying to use the framework to fix a problem. So this could be you tomorrow if you're willing to join me in the afternoon. It does get a little weird, but it's all safe. All right, so we create abstractions and use frameworks. That's the last principle. So let's move on to vision. So even if you internalize all of these principles and you say, oh yeah, Eric, I use all those things in my work every day. Great, that's wonderful. But if you don't have a vision for where you want to go, a personal vision for where you want to go, and you're still going to be changing the world in someone else's vision, right? We work in companies, most of us. And you can't just do something that's totally radical to your company's vision, right? Maybe it has to fall in line, but maybe that means if you have a personal vision for where you want to see the future and what that looks like, maybe you need to find a different job. But I think it's important. I think this, again, ties back into what some of the stuff that Dan was saying this morning is we all need to go through this thought process of having a vision for your own lives, for your own careers, and ultimately the stuff that we make is going to create this world that we live in, this shared world that we live in. So you have to have a vision for what you want that to be. Otherwise, we end up with something like this, right? And we all sort of fall into this trap where we just live passively through the activity of other people, right? There's a lot of people that don't fall into this, and they just sort of do the work, and we're like, oh, that's kind of awesome. Why don't I just sort of ride on their coattails? And you can do that. That's fine, but I don't think it's... I'd like to live in a world where everyone has a voice for the world that they want to live in, and we all articulate that voice to each other, and we share that, and then collectively we move forward. So how do you do this? Like I said, I started running 3 years ago, and I read an article that really changed my life in terms of running, and it was this idea of putting identity before effort. So a lot of runners fall into the trap of, well, when am I really a runner, right? Oh, I just started today. Am I really a runner yet? I had to walk half the way. Well, Saturday I walked at least half the way. But I was still a runner. So if you define yourself like, oh, it's not till I run a 5K that I'm a runner, or it's not till I run a 5K at a certain time that I'm a runner, or it's not that until I run a marathon, then I'm a runner. Like, if you fall into that trap, you're setting yourself up for failure, right? Because you're always going to drop some effort somewhere. There's going to be a day or a week that you don't run like you should have, and then you start to question your identity because your identity is tied into this effort, right? And I think that's a trap that a lot of us fall into. But if you just flip that and you say, no, I'm a runner. Well, what do runners do? Well, they run. Well, that makes it really easy. So I live in Michigan like Dan does, and it gets really cold during the winter time. And I still go out and run when it's single digits and below zero, and because that's just what runners do. So when I don't want to run, I just remember I'm a runner, and that's what we do. And you're like, oh, great, Eric, that's really wonderful, but how do you get to that part where you just appropriate the identity of something that you're not? So I think it's similar to the VR talk this morning, right? You use visualization. Well, you don't need VR systems to visualize, right? You just do it in your mind's eye, or you can do something else which is even more powerful, which is you create totems and artifacts that remind you of this vision, this identity that you want to appropriate. So those are an old pair of my running shoes I used to have right next to my bed. So the last thing I saw before I went to sleep was my running shoes. The first thing I saw when I got up were my running shoes, because I'm a runner now. That's what I do. So it's just this reminder, right? These artifacts. So you create these artifacts in your life that remind you of this identity that you want to appropriate, and eventually, that's just what you are. And you just do it. It's different from this idea of fake it till I make it, right? Because you're believing it, and you're changing the way that you're thinking through these artifacts that you surround yourself with. So NASA space program does the same thing. I have these posters in my house. They're amazing and awesome. But there is no tour of Mars that you can sign up for. There's no grand tour of the solar system that you can go and take. I wish there were, but they're not. But NASA has this vision for the future of where they want to go. And instead of just talking about it, they've created these artifacts, right? They've hired artists to create these artifacts, these posters, that say this is the future world that we want to live in, where it's trivial to have a tour of Mars and a grand tour of the solar system. And it seems like a subtle change, but by creating these artifacts, we can now sort of more easily manifest these future identities that we want to create. So a third example, this is a sort of internal project that Scott and I worked on when we worked at the studio together. We had a different idea for what it meant to embed sensors into retail environments. We thought it was super creepy to this vision where some sensor is going to identify me and then adapt my environment to sort of target market me and things like that. And that's not what we wanted to do. That's not the world that we wanted to live in. We wanted to essentially embed a retail space with sensors, sort of layer of nerve cells, that was invisible to the end customer. As far as they were concerned, they didn't have direct access to this layer of sensor networks. So we built simple Arduino-based sensor network and put it in the store. Here's some tests in the studio. And the idea is that the people wouldn't interact with this directly. It's just counting them, right? They're just counters. That's all it's really doing. But the store owner would have access to this data. And then the store owner could make decisions around how they structured the store to indirectly benefit the customers as opposed to the sensors directly benefiting the customers, right? It's a very subtle but different approach. So we put this in the store, and pretty quickly before we even had an interface prototyped up and we were just sort of showing numbers, the store owner, who was there almost every day, all day long, while people were in his store, all of a sudden when he started to see the data, he started to see that there were some bottlenecks and people weren't going to the back of the store, even though he was standing there literally all day long, seeing the same stuff with his own eyes. It wasn't until he saw the data that he could sort of make changes and open up some fixtures, and then he was getting better traffic flow to the back of the store. So we did a bunch of other stuff. Scott had to develop sort of roll his own computer vision system so we can know how many people were in the store at any given time, but I'm not going to go into all this stuff. But the idea I want you to take away from this is that you have to take steps to make your future vision a reality. You have to make something. It's not enough to just talk about it. You have to make something, because maybe you're wrong. Maybe that future vision that you had is really scary once you start making it and you want to do something different. Well, let's find out now, right? So start making something. So the question I asked you is, what's the future vision that you want to have? What's the future world that you want to live in, both professionally and personally? And then what are you going to do to start making that happen? Start sharing that vision that you have with your friends, your family, your colleagues. What's the world that you want to see? You might be surprised that you find collaborators that want to go in the same place that you do, and then you can start making something. So with that, I believe strongly that all of us are responsible for creating the future. And I don't take this lightly, right? But I think we have to have a vision for what's the future that we want to see. And every artifact that we create shapes this future world, so it's important. All these little design decisions that we're making, all the stuff that we put out into the world, creates this world that we're going to live in. So be mindful of what you're making. And in the end, I want us all to make stuff that matters. So with that, thank you.